The girl who was punished for crying. Imagine you are 9 years old. You've just been taken from your mother's arms, ripped away with barely a goodbye. The door slams behind you. You are marched, eyes red and lips trembling, through stone corridors into a cold, echoing hall. Around you, the faces of other children stare, hollow and silent. No one meets your gaze for long. Here, in this institution, call it a workhouse, an orphanage, a reformatory, tears are forbidden. Grief is punished. Emotion is weakness. This is not a story of rare cruelty, but a snapshot of a real system. A system that operated across the English-speaking world in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the industrial age, poverty exploded in cities. Families collapsed under disease and unemployment. The authorities, clergy, government, charity boards, sought to solve the problem of destitute children by locking them away. Their logic was simple, brutal, and self-justifying. Children must be made useful, orderly, and unemotional. Inmates, as they were called, were not allowed to miss their parents or mourn the lives they had lost. In one such institution, a 9-year-old girl, her name lost to time, but her story preserved in the faded records of a Victorian workhouse, could not help herself. On her first night, after the last prayer was mumbled and the warden stalked the aisles, she began to cry. The sound was soft at first, a shudder, a gasp, a plea whispered into straw bedding. But in the night silence, everything echoed. A matron heard her. The next morning, the girl was summoned to the head office. There, in front of a desk heavy with ledgers and keys, she was told emotion was a weakness of the idle. Grief, they insisted, was a form of laziness. To weep was to rebel. To mourn was to question the order that kept the world from slipping into chaos. Her punishment was swift and calculated to break her spirit. She was beaten, once across the knuckles, once across the back, and then marched to the solitary cell. This was no ordinary room, but a stone closet with no bed, no blanket, barely enough light to see the spiders crawling in the cracks. Her meals for the week would be bread and water, nothing else. No comfort, no books, no voices, no warmth. In this cell, she would be left alone to consider her crime, the crime of longing for her mother, the sin of tears. What kind of society invents such a punishment? The answer is uncomfortable. For generations, institutions were shaped by a philosophy that saw poverty and misfortune not as tragedy, but as moral failure. Children were to be molded, not healed. The language of the time, found in sermons, government documents, and charity reports, was unrelenting. Workhouses claimed that idleness bred sin. Orphanages insisted that discipline was salvation. Reformatories wrote that hardened children must be broken to obedience for their own good. Emotion was seen as the enemy of order. Boys were flogged for stammering during roll call. Girls were locked in cupboards for comforting each other. Any sign of longing for family or home was interpreted as a threat, a seed of rebellion that could infect others. Tears were unmanly in boys, ungrateful in girls. Children who wept too much were described in medical files as melancholic or troublesome. Their grief pathologized instead of consoled. In the solitary cell, the girl's cries went unheard. Her world shrank to hunger and darkness. The bread grew stale, the water tasted of tin. She learned that comfort could not be found in kindness, but only in silence. The first lesson of institutional life was that your heart must become a locked box. Some children, especially the very young, broke quickly. Others became hard, their faces blank, their eyes glassy. A few, against all odds, kept something alive, a secret store of feeling that might one day bloom again. If you wonder how these punishments were justified, read the words of the period. Inspectors wrote that solitary confinement is a necessary tool against willfulness. Religious leaders preached that a child's soul must be purified through suffering. Newspapers praised the discipline of such places, celebrating every tale of reform and redemption. The staff, often women who were themselves products of poverty or orphanhood, passed on what had been done to them, convinced that pain was the only path to virtue. But the records did not capture everything. In the margins, sometimes in secret letters or hidden testimonies, other stories survive. Stories of children who risked beatings to share crusts of bread or whispered songs through cracks in the wall. matrons who smuggled out orphans on stormy nights, unable to bear one more cry, and survivors, years later, who remembered not the pain of the rod, but the shame of knowing their sorrow was forbidden. Over time, reformers and advocates exposed these cruelties. Journalists published exposés of children starved, beaten, locked in darkness for days. Doctors protested the harm done to minds and bodies. A new language emerged, one that saw grief as natural, mourning as necessary, and tears as a mark of humanity, not disgrace. Laws slowly changed. Solitary confinement was banned for children in some countries, then all. Orphanages were scrutinized, reformed, or shuttered, and still, the scars remained. Even today, the story of the girl punished for crying echoes in our world. The architecture may have changed, the uniforms replaced by softer clothes, but the old fear of emotion lingers in schools, foster care, and even families. Children are told to be brave, to move on, to grow up fast. The world is still uneasy with tears, and somewhere, behind every rulebook and policy, lies the memory of that 9-year-old girl, her face pressed to cold stone, learning in agony the cost of feeling. If you ever wonder why history matters, remember her. Remember the millions like her, nameless but not forgotten, who paid the price for a society's fear of grief. Their silence was not a choice, but a sentence. Their tears, a rebellion against a world determined to harden every heart. We owe them more than memory. We owe them the courage to make room for sorrow, to comfort those who mourn, to promise that no child will ever be punished for feeling too much. The boy who froze to death in the yard. In the chill of a winter morning in 1871, the world offered no mercy to the forgotten. It was the kind of darkness that feels heavier than night, the cold pressing in, the sky an iron lid over a world divided by privilege and want. In the slums and alleys of Victorian England, thousands of children like Thomas drifted through the fog, living half in shadow, half in hope. Some survived by grit and chance, others, like Thomas, left only a brief silent mark on the world before vanishing into the ice. Thomas was 12 years old, if the orphanage ledgers are to be believed. His birth was never celebrated, his parents long gone, lost to fever or drink, or simply the relentless tide of poverty that washed over the cities. He arrived at the parish orphanage in the spring of 1867, already wary, already older than his years. In a ledger, his name is scrawled between other children, most of them dead or vanished by adulthood. His only legacy, a set of initials, a guessed at age, and the word foundling. The institution that took him in was no refuge. Orphanages in the 19th century were meant as places of salvation, but they were just as often places of suffering. The stone building in which Thomas lived was drafty and gray, surrounded by a high wall. Its corridors echoed with the footsteps of matrons and the muffled sobs of children. Every morning, the boys were roused before sunrise for chores, scrubbing floors, tending the fires, emptying chamber pots, and, in the coldest months, scraping ice from the flagstones of the yard. Winter that year was brutal. Newspapers in 1871 reported weeks of frost and ice, gas lights flickering dimly in the fog, horses collapsing in the streets, and water pipes shattering in the cold. For the poor, it was an old enemy, a test of endurance that rarely ended in triumph. Coal was precious, wool scarcer still, and the orphans' beds were little more than straw pallets in freezing dormitories. The staff wore coats and gloves. The children, if they were lucky, were given thin, patched rags. Shoes were for the favored few. Most went barefoot, even on stone. On the morning of January 15th, the head matron ordered Thomas outside before dawn. The night had laid a sheet of ice over the yard, threatening to send anyone who crossed it sprawling. It was Thomas's task that morning to chip away the frost so the staff could walk without slipping. He was handed a battered iron shovel and told to hurry. No coat, no shoes, not even gloves. The matron's only words were, "Do not come back in until it is done." The sky was still dark as Thomas stepped into the yard. A low wind crept through the gaps in the walls, curling around his ankles, biting at his hands and feet. The cold was not just an absence of warmth, but a presence, a relentless force, filling his lungs, freezing his breath, turning every movement into a struggle. The stone flags of the yard were slick and treacherous, and each swing of the shovel sent a jolt up his arms. Within minutes, his fingers burned, then grew numb. His feet lost all feeling. But there was nowhere else to go. The windows of the orphanage glowed with weak candlelight. Behind them, the staff drank their morning tea and read the papers, never glancing at the boy in the yard. Nobody knows how long Thomas lasted. Perhaps an hour, perhaps 2. A neighbor, leaving for work at dawn, glimpsed him from over the wall. Slumped on his knees, the shovel fallen beside him, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. By the time the kitchen maid found him, he was curled against the cold stone, his face turned toward the wall, as if listening for some last word of comfort. His skin was white-blue, his lips already darkening. He was carried inside and placed by the fire, but it was far too late. The doctor, summoned from a nearby street, pronounced him dead. Exposure and exhaustion, he wrote in his journal, though he might as well have written neglect or indifference. The parish did not want scandal. The matron claimed Thomas was used to the cold, that he had begged to do the work himself. The coroner's inquest was brief, perfunctory. No one from the orphanage was punished. No one lost their job. The newspapers did not print his name or even the story, except for a single line in the local death notices. Thomas, age 12, found dead of exposure at St. Leonard's home, no family. But among the children who shared that stone-walled life, the story was not forgotten. They spoke of Thomas in whispers, shivering in their beds, fearing their turn would come next. Some remembered how he had tried to barter his bread for a pair of socks, how he had flinched at the sound of the bell, knowing it meant more work, more cold, more silence. For the adults, Thomas was a problem solved, a page turned. For the orphans, he became a silent companion, a warning, a martyr, a memory clinging to the icy flagstones long after the frost had melted. His death was not an anomaly. In Victorian England, the lives of poor children were measured in chores, beatings, hunger, and a kind of institutionalized neglect that was invisible to the comfortable. Inquests and reports from the era detail countless stories of children frozen to death in attics, under bridges, on doorsteps, or, like Thomas, in the very institutions meant to save them. Reformers like Charles Dickens and Lord Shaftesbury railed against these horrors, their writings and speeches echoing with the fury of conscience. Yet, for every outrage, 100 stories went unspoken, each one a Thomas, a ghost in the ledger. What made Thomas's fate so bitter was not only the cruelty of the cold, but the utter lack of justice. In the world of the 19th century poor, suffering was not a crime, but a condition, something to be endured, not rectified. The staff at the orphanage went on with their lives, untroubled. The matron kept her post. The city kept its secrets. Only the frost remembered. Today his grave is unmarked, lost beneath the stones of a churchyard that has long since swallowed its own history. The orphanage is gone, replaced by shops and flats, its walls erased by time. But sometimes, on the coldest mornings, a thin mist creeps along the ground where the yard once stood, and the old people in the neighborhood, those who remember the stories their grandparents told, say that if you listen closely, you can hear the scrape of an iron shovel, the faintest whisper of bare feet on ice. Thomas's story is not unique. It is the story of an age, of a world that learned too late how high the price of indifference could be. It's a lesson written in frost and silence, a warning that civilization is measured not by its monuments, but by how it treats its most vulnerable. In the memory of one small boy, lost to the cold and left unavenged, the true soul of an era is laid bare, waiting even now to be recognized, remembered, and perhaps mourned. Forced to eat rotten meat or starve. In the heart of 19th century England, as the Industrial Revolution redrew the map of poverty, there stood places more feared than prisons. Grim, fortress-like institutions called workhouses. Built for the deserving poor, these stone monoliths were meant to offer shelter and discipline. In reality, for many, they became factories of despair, where hope itself was ground to dust. Among the darkest of these places, one name echoes with particular horror: Andover. There, the phrase "eat or starve" was no metaphor. It was a daily, stomach-churning ultimatum, etched into the lives and bodies of the desperate, and etched forever into the record of British social reform. To understand what happened at Andover, you must picture England in the 1840s, a nation caught between moral panic and economic crisis. The old poor laws, systems of local charity and parish relief, were replaced by the new poor law of 1834. Its philosophy was simple. Poverty was to be punished, not relieved. Workhouses would be made less eligible, worse in every way than the lowest paid job. Families were split apart. Inmates wore uniforms, worked long hours, and lived under the eyes of stern masters whose authority was nearly absolute. Andover, in the southern county of Hampshire, was typical in design and intention. From the outside, it looked almost respectable: high walls, tidy gates, a neat yard. Inside, it was a world apart, cold, overcrowded, with air thick from too many bodies and not enough ventilation. The food was plain, monotonous, and always just enough to prevent starvation. No more. For many, the main work was breaking bones, literally. The workhouse supplied ground-up animal bones for fertilizer, a task as back-breaking and demoralizing as any devised by bureaucracy. Men, women, and even children smashed and sifted bones from dawn to dusk, their hands raw and their spirits broken. But even these conditions would pale beside the scandal that would erupt in the 1840s, the case of the rotten meat. It began, as so many such stories do, with whispers. Inmates, already weak from poor rations and endless labor, began to fall violently ill. There was vomiting, fever, agony that spread like a plague. Those who could walk stumbled to the matron or the master and begged for help. The answer was always the same: silence, dismissal, threats. To complain was to risk punishment: solitary confinement, reduced rations, public shaming before the entire workhouse. The meat, when it arrived, was already suspicious. Carts would bring in barrels of salt beef or salt pork, cheap, heavily preserved, purchased by contractors at the lowest price. When the barrels were opened, the smell was unmistakable: sour, putrid, crawling with maggots in summer. The meat was already half rotten before it touched a cooking pot. Sometimes, the cooks tried to disguise it, boiling it for hours, drowning it in onions, or simply chopping away the worst parts and hoping no one would notice. But the taste, the texture, the smell, all betrayed the truth. And still, there was no alternative. The rules of the workhouse were strict: accept what you're given or go hungry. For many, the choice was clear. Children, the sick, the elderly, all forced the food down, retching between bites, hoping the sickness would pass. For some, it did. For others, the result was dysentery, fever, and sometimes silent death in the night. The official records kept by the master rarely reflected the real toll. Word spread, but not to those who could help. The guardians, wealthy men charged with running the workhouse, visited rarely and cared less. Inspections, if they occurred at all, were cursory, announced in advance, and performed with a kind of willful blindness. Any inmate who dared speak out risked not just punishment, but expulsion, effectively a death sentence for the very poor. It might have continued this way, a closed system of misery, if not for a man named Henry Parker, one of the poor law inspectors dispatched from London. He arrived at Andover in the mid-1840s, driven by rumors of shocking neglect. What he found was beyond even the era's hardened expectations. The stench of the kitchens, the gaunt faces of the inmates, the stacks of spoiled meat, each detail confirmed the worst suspicions. Parker listened, quietly and without judgment, as the inmates told their stories. Men described fighting over the least rotten scraps. Women described trying to soothe their starving children with broth so bitter it brought tears. Some inmates confessed, in shame, to gnawing on the very bones they were supposed to crush for fertilizer, hoping to find a scrap of marrow or gristle. Better the sickness, one man said, than the empty pain of hunger. Parker reported his findings to the central authorities, and a national scandal erupted. Newspapers seized on the details: rotten meat, emaciated bodies, a system that turned charity into torture. Debates raged in Parliament. How could a Christian nation allow such suffering in institutions supposedly founded on mercy and reform? The guardians were called to answer for their actions. Some denied, others blamed the contractors. Still others tried to silence witnesses or shift the blame to the inmates themselves. But the truth could not be buried. The Andover scandal became a turning point in the history of British social welfare. Public outrage forced a reckoning. Investigations led to dismissals, reforms, and, eventually, the overhaul of the workhouse system itself. New rules demanded transparency, better food, and oversight by people with at least a measure of compassion. For those who survived Andover, the scars lingered. Some never recovered their health. Others lived with the memory of hunger and humiliation until their dying day. Yet, out of their suffering came a legacy, a reminder that systems built on cruelty cannot last forever, and that even the most powerless can, in the end, force the world to listen. Today, the old workhouse still stands, repurposed into apartments and offices, but beneath the new paint and polished floors, the stones remember, and so should we. The story of Andover is not just about a building or a policy. It's about the choices a society makes when faced with suffering. To force the desperate to eat rotten meat or starve is to betray not just them, but ourselves. In every age, the question returns: who will speak for the silent? Who will notice the suffering when those in power look away? At Andover, for a brief blazing moment, the truth broke through, and it changed everything. The sewing room that crippled a generation. In the shadowed corners of the industrial age, behind the bright shop fronts and the new machine-powered wonders that dazzled the world, there existed places that never made it into the triumphal paintings or the proud public speeches. One of those places was the sewing room, a world not of invention and progress, but of cold, endless suffering, where the cost of every stitch was measured in childhood stolen, bodies twisted, and spirits broken so quietly that no one outside those walls ever truly understood the depth of what was lost. The Industrial Revolution changed the world's fabric, but it did so by unraveling lives. In cities from Manchester to New York, and in countless smaller towns whose names history forgets, textile factories and garment workshops sprang up like a fever. Their hunger for labor was insatiable, and children, especially girls, were the easiest prey. It was common, almost expected, for girls as young as 7 to be sent into the sewing rooms. Some came as orphans, others were the daughters of the desperate poor, their tiny hands considered perfect for the fine, relentless work that adult fingers found too tedious or fatiguing. The rooms themselves were little more than converted basements or cramped attic spaces, usually unheated and uninsulated. In winter, the cold was so intense that breath would mist and needles would freeze in fingers, only to thaw and rust as the day wore on. In summer, the air was thick with lint, sweat, and the heavy metallic odor of damp cloth and blood. There was never enough light. Windows, if they existed, were kept grimy to discourage the children from looking out. Most of the illumination came from flickering lamps or guttering candles, their light distorted by the haze of dust and oil. 12-hour shifts were the rule, not the exception. Supervisors, nearly always men, paced the rows of work tables like predators. They were charged not with nurturing skill, but with extracting every possible ounce of labor. Their presence was a threat. Posture was scrutinized, backs were forced into unnatural bows for hours at a time. Any sign of distraction, fatigue, or defiance was met with punishment. Docked wages, beatings, or a slap to the head that left ringing in the ears for days. There was no talking. There was no singing. There was only the steady, ceaseless rhythm of hundreds of needles rising and falling, and the muffled weeping that sometimes escaped from lips pressed tight in fear. The toll was written in the bodies of the girls. The bent posture demanded by the work, and enforced with cruelty by supervisors, caused more than discomfort. Over weeks and months, spines began to curve. Over years, the deformity became permanent. Doctors, when they bothered to examine these girls, gave names to the afflictions: scoliosis, kyphosis, chronic sciatica, and seamstress's hunch. The girls themselves used no such words. They simply learned to move carefully, to hide the pain, to pretend their backs and necks did not burn with every breath. Some were crippled before they reached adulthood. Others, still children in age, moved with the stoop of the elderly, their bodies marked forever by the geometry of their suffering. Eyesight was the next to go. The light was never enough, and the strain of threading fine needles and inspecting minuscule stitches in the half-dark, ruined vision at terrifying speed. By 12, many were half-blind. By 16, some were unable to work at all, discarded, unemployable, forced into lives of begging or worse. Needles themselves were a hazard. They rusted quickly in the cold, damp air, and the slightest prick could turn into a festering wound. Tetanus and blood poisoning were silent killers. Bandages were rare luxuries, and infection often meant losing a finger, a hand, or, slowly, painfully, life itself. But perhaps worst of all was the quiet, everyday violence of hope destroyed. Most of these girls never learned to read or write. Their lives were too consumed by exhaustion to allow for learning, dreaming, or even play. Childhood was a memory stolen before it had a chance to form. Families relied on the pennies their daughters earned. And so the cycle continued. Generation after generation, a silent epidemic of bent spines and darkened eyes passed from mother to daughter like a curse. When reformers finally began to take notice in the late 19th century, the reports were met with a mixture of horror and denial. Factory owners insisted the work was character building. Some politicians accused the critics of exaggeration. But evidence was everywhere, in the crowded hospitals and crippled wards, in the charity homes overflowing with ruined children, and in the graveyards that filled with nameless girls who never reached their 15th birthday. Testimonies from survivors began to emerge. One remembered how, in winter, her hands would freeze to the needle and have to be pried free with a knife. Another recalled the terror of hearing a supervisor's footsteps behind her, knowing that any lapse in the speed of her stitching could mean punishment. Others simply described the hunger that gnawed constantly, the aches that never faded, and the dreams of sunlight and laughter that faded year by year until they became as impossible as fairy tales. Medical journals of the era finally recorded the obvious. Whole generations of women, permanently deformed and disabled, were the direct legacy of the sewing rooms. Campaigners fought for child labor laws, for shorter hours, for better ventilation and heating, for the right to stand and stretch and see the sun. Slowly, reforms crept in, but always too late for those who had already paid the price. Many who survived the sewing rooms lived to old age, but their bodies were reminders, silent, stooped, and often in pain, of what the world was willing to sacrifice in the name of progress. Today, in museum displays and faded photographs, the story of the sewing rooms remains a testament to both cruelty and resilience. We look back in horror, but also in uneasy recognition. The price of comfort, fashion, and industrial wealth was extracted from the youngest and most vulnerable, hidden away in rooms where the world chose not to look. The story of the sewing room is not just a chapter in the history of industry. It is a warning written in bent spines and dimmed eyes, in the echo of needles still rising and falling long after the last sewing room fell silent. So, next time you pass a tailor shop or run your fingers over the fine stitches in a new garment, pause for a moment and remember, there was a time when each stitch was paid for not just in coin, but in childhood, in health, and in the hope of a generation. The sewing rooms are gone, but the lesson they taught, the cost of ignoring suffering in pursuit of profit, remains as vital and urgent as ever. The night watchman who reported the ghosts. In the gray fog-shrouded dawns of Victorian England, the Yorkshire workhouses loomed like silent sentinels at the edge of every town, built to contain poverty, not cure it. Their stone walls hid a world that most citizens would never see. Inside, the desperate poor were stripped of dignity, forced to labor in silence, and divided from family by rules harsher than the winter wind. To the city fathers, the workhouse was an institution of mercy, discipline for the idle, food for the starving, shelter for the abandoned. But to those within, it was more often a machine for breaking bodies and spirits alike. Within these walls, after the lamps had dimmed and the last whispers of the day had died away, the only soul awake was often the night watchman. He was an invisible figure, slipping through the chill corridors, his footsteps muffled by stone and fear. It was said that a true watchman never feared ghosts, for in the workhouse, the living had more reason to haunt than the dead. But, for one solitary guard in Yorkshire, the line between ghost story and real horror blurred one December night, and what he discovered was something no soul could ever forget. His name appears in a few faded ledgers, a former soldier, down on his luck, who took the thankless job to earn enough coins for bread and warmth. His duties were simple: keep the peace, check the doors, and ensure no desperate inmate tried to escape into the freezing dark. Yet, as he made his midnight rounds, he became accustomed to the peculiar atmosphere that clung to the workhouse, the feeling that suffering had left an echo, a residue of misery in every stone. But on this particular night, as sleet rattled the window panes and the wind moaned in the gutters, something unusual caught his attention. In the corridor that ran behind the nursery, he paused. At first, he thought it was just the night, shifting timbers, the groan of ancient pipes. Then, he heard it again. A thin, pitiful moaning, barely louder than the wind, coming from behind a bricked wall near the nursery. Haunted by the sound, he hesitated, weighing his next move. The rules discouraged curiosity, better to ignore what you could not explain. But the moaning persisted, frail and desperate, threading through the darkness. He lit his lantern and pressed his ear to the cold stone. It was not the wail of a spirit, but the choked, muffled cries of children. Small, raw voices slipping through cracks. His heart pounding, the watchman hurried to the matron's office, demanding the keys. The matron, a woman hardened by years in the system, grumbled but finally relented, and together they unlocked the door behind the nursery. What they found was a room so cold the lantern's light seemed to shiver. In a corner, bundled in rags and feverish, lay 2 infants. Their lips were parched, their faces hollow, eyes sunken with thirst and terror. A bucket for water stood dry. A bowl of gruel was untouched, left days before, now crusted to stone. Records would later show the infants had been left there after falling sick, isolated from the other children to prevent infection. The nurse on duty claimed to have checked on them, but in truth the door had not been opened in more than a day. For over 24 hours, the children had lain in darkness, hungry and alone, their tiny bodies battling sickness and cold. The weaker of the 2 had already slipped into unconsciousness. By morning, he was gone. The watchman, shaken to his core, filed a report. He described the cries in the night, the neglect, the horror of a child dying behind locked doors. But the wheels of the workhouse bureaucracy turned slowly, if at all. The matron urged silence. An official scandal would cost her position and invite censure from the parish board. The master, fearful of bad press and public outrage, dismissed the matter as an unfortunate oversight. The child was quietly buried in a pauper's grave, no ceremony, no marker. The survivor, too weak to speak, was returned to the ward. The report was folded, sealed, and tucked into a ledger, never to be mentioned again. For the watchman, the night did not end. He found himself haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory. He spoke of the incident to other guards in hushed tones. Some shrugged and turned away, insisting these things happened, that nothing could change the machine of poverty. Others urged him to forget it, lest he lose the meager job he depended on. Yet he could not ignore the feeling that something terrible had passed through his hands, that he had glimpsed a truth too dark to bear. In the workhouse, ghosts did not walk the corridors. They were made, night after night, from flesh and blood. Stories like his surfaced now and then, buried in coroners' inquests or exposed by rare whistleblowers. But the machinery of the poor law was vast and relentless. The goal was efficiency, not compassion. Sick children were a liability, an expense, a risk to the healthy, an embarrassment if they died en masse. Officials spoke of Christian duty, but in practice, duty bowed to budget, and mercy was measured in pence. Few dared to question the system, and those who did were often silenced, their reports lost or suppressed, their warnings dismissed as exaggerations. Yet word spread. The workhouse gained a reputation, not just for cold and hunger, but for the sense that the walls themselves could hear suffering, that every sob and whisper echoed in eternity. After the watchman's report was buried, strange tales grew. Some said the moans never truly faded from behind the nursery wall. Nurses swore they sometimes heard a baby crying when the room was empty, or felt a sudden chill as they passed the door. Children told stories of seeing a pale boy standing in the shadows, watching silently, gone when the light returned. Today, the workhouses have vanished, their stones reclaimed by grass and time, but the story of the night watchman who reported the ghosts remains, a testament to the unseen cruelties of a system that prized order above compassion, that allowed the weakest to slip away, unheard and unmourned. His courage was buried with his report, but his witness lingers, a reminder that sometimes the worst ghosts are the ones we make ourselves. For in those nights, behind those nursery walls, history is not just a chronicle of dates and decrees. It is a record of hunger and hope, of voices lost in the dark, and of the few who dared to listen, even when all the world wanted silence. The rats ate the bread before the children did. Picture a grim dawn in 1863, in the heart of industrial London. Smoke curls above the chimneys, fog clings to the filthy cobblestones, and inside the city's hulking workhouse, a queue of thin, shivering children shuffles down a corridor toward their only certainty of the day, a ration of bread. These children are orphans, paupers, or undeserving poor, whatever the authorities chose to call them, sentenced by circumstance to a life where even a crust of bread is a privilege, not a right. What the children don't know, at least not until their turn comes at the battered door of the storeroom, is that something else got to their bread first. In that dank, shadowy pantry, the true rulers are not cooks or overseers, but rats, dozens of them. The storeroom, never properly cleaned, crawls with life after midnight. Rats squeeze through floorboards, wriggle over sacks of flour, and chew their way into the bins of bread meant for the workhouse children. By sunrise, the loaves are already ragged, punctured by small, sharp teeth, sometimes soaked through with filth. The scandal breaks when one boy, maybe too hungry, maybe too angry to stay quiet, raises his hand and tells the truth. He says the bread is crawling with droppings. He says he watched a rat drag a chunk away before breakfast. He says he is afraid to eat, and he is not alone. For a moment, the silence in the dining hall grows thick. Some children look down. Others stare at the floor, lips pressed tight. Everyone knows, but no one dares say more. In a just world, his complaint would spark outrage, investigation, change. But this is the world of the Victorian Workhouse, a place designed not for comfort, but for discipline and deterrence. When the complaint finally reaches the office of the master, it is not the cook who is summoned for questioning, it is the boy. He stands before the officials, small, thin, his fingers worrying the edge of his ragged shirt. They tell him that he is a liar, a troublemaker, ungrateful for the charity that keeps him alive. They say that rats are the way of the city, and that complaints about food are proof of a spoiled spirit. The master dismisses the cook with a warning and a knowing wink. After all, to blame the kitchen would be to admit the system had failed. To acknowledge the rats would be to open the door to 1,000 other complaints about spoiled meat, watered soup, cold dormitories, violence, disease. Far easier to silence the accuser. The boy is punished, and depending on the report, may be beaten, sent to solitary, or simply thrown out, discharged for insolence. As the official logbook notes, in the eyes of the institution, he is the rat, but the real rats remain. The next morning, the children return to the storeroom, to the loaves pocked with holes, and they eat what's left, because to refuse food is to invite more punishment. Hunger, after all, is the greatest weapon of control in the workhouse. The staff know that the children will eat, no matter how filthy the bread. A child's complaint is easy to erase, hunger is not. And so it continued, year after year. In London alone, hundreds of workhouses served as dumping grounds for the city's poor, governed by the harsh laws of the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. This act, meant to cut costs and force the indigent to improve themselves, turned the workhouse into a place where deprivation was not an accident, but a feature. Food was rationed and inspected, but always on the cheap. Loaves were baked in bulk, left in storerooms where rats outnumbered humans, and then divided with little care for sanitation. If you doubt this, read the reports of the era. In 1863, a committee investigating the London workhouses found case after case of spoiled food, rodent infestations, and neglect. Testimonies from survivors, inspectors, and even a few reform-minded staff paint the same picture. Hunger gnawed at children's bellies, but so did disgust and fear. In some places, children became expert at tapping loaves to shake out the droppings before swallowing. Sometimes, the rats were so bold they skittered across the floor while the meals were being served. But why did the system endure? Why did no one stop it? The answer is as ugly as the bread. For the ruling classes, the suffering of the poor was considered a necessary lesson. Hardship would purify, discipline would redeem, and charity was always conditional, never free of humiliation. Those who questioned the rules, even for the sake of health or justice, were threats to be removed. It was better, in the minds of the masters, for 100 children to eat filth than for a single complaint to be seen as valid. Sometimes, the outside world heard. Newspapers ran lurid stories about vermin-infested bread, hoping to stir outrage. Reformers, Charles Dickens among them, shamed the authorities with novels, speeches, and open letters. And slowly, across decades, things changed. Inspections grew stricter, kitchens cleaner, punishments less arbitrary. The last workhouses closed in the 20th century, their stones now silent, their records gathering dust in archives. But the lesson lingers. The story of the rats and the bread is more than a detail of history. It is a window into the casual cruelty of systems built on neglect and denial. It is a reminder that the weak are easiest to blame, and that truth-tellers, especially poor, hungry children, are too often punished for speaking up. The rats, in the end, were only ever rats. The real crime belonged to the men who let them feast first, and the world that looked away. If you ever visit a ruined workhouse, run your hand along the crumbling brick, and remember the children who waited for bread and found only the marks of hunger and the silence of a world that did not want to listen. Locked in. The woman who gave birth alone. Some stories of cruelty never make it into the official records. They hide in the cracks of history, whispered from one survivor to the next, echoing through the old brick laundries and abandoned wards where suffering became so routine it faded into silence. Tonight, we open the door on one of those forgotten tragedies, the story of a woman who, instead of receiving help at her most vulnerable moment, was locked in alone with her pain. It is a story about a world that mistook desperation for mischief and the irreversible consequences that followed. Picture a sprawling institution in the late 1800s, a home for the destitute, or perhaps a workhouse, or one of the notorious Magdalen laundries. The buildings are imposing, built of thick stone, designed less for comfort than for control. The air is heavy with steam and the sour scent of soap, the endless thud and scrape of washing boards blending with the occasional sharp cry that is quickly hushed by a matron's glare. Here, rules matter more than mercy. The staff are trained not to listen to stories, but to enforce discipline. The women inside are there for all the reasons society wants to forget: poverty, orphanhood, unwed pregnancy, mental illness, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is here that our story unfolds. Among the endless heaps of linen, a young woman labors at her daily chores, her swollen belly making every movement difficult. She has asked, quietly then desperately, for rest, but she is ignored. Her complaints are chalked up to laziness, attention-seeking, or the manipulations of fallen women. So she stays at her post, wrists raw, feet swollen, hope dwindling with every contraction that tightens across her abdomen. As dusk falls, the pain intensifies, cutting through her with a force that leaves her gasping. She drops her basket of laundry and doubles over. Some of the other women, haunted by memories of their own, try to help, but the matron's eyes are always watching. "Get back to work," comes the order, sharp as a slap. When the woman pleads, voice hoarse and broken, the matron only sneers. "You're not fooling anyone with your theatrics. If you want attention, you can have it, alone." With those words, the matron shoves the woman into the cold laundry storeroom and turns the key, locking the heavy door. The hours that follow are a private torment, unseen and unremembered by the institution that was supposed to care. Alone on the hard stone floor, the woman labors, her cries muffled by thick walls and thicker indifference. There are no midwives, no clean water, no comforting hand. The only witnesses are the shadows and the damp, the ceaseless hum of distant machinery, and the flicker of hope that help might still come. She tries to keep quiet at first, terrified of punishment if she makes too much noise. But pain makes its own demands, and soon her voice rises in waves of agony and terror. No one answers. The night grows colder. Time slows to a crawl. She drifts in and out of consciousness, fighting waves of exhaustion and fear, clutching her belly as the contractions come faster, harder. In the small hours of the morning, the child is born, tiny, blue, and still. There are no blankets, no warm arms, only the echo of her own ragged breathing and the final, unbearable silence. When dawn breaks, the matron unlocks the door, her face hard, expecting to find a woman chastened and compliant. Instead, she finds the woman collapsed on the floor, arms wrapped around the lifeless child. For a moment, even the matron is silent, but the institution's routines march on. The death is recorded, if at all, in cold, clinical language. Child deceased, mother in distress, no staff at fault. No one is held responsible. The woman, once she is able to stand, is sent back to work. Grief is not an excuse for idleness. The laundry must be done. To modern ears, this story sounds almost unbelievable, but it is rooted in thousands of real accounts from the records of workhouses, poorhouses, and so-called homes for wayward women across Britain, Ireland, America, and beyond. In these places, pregnant women, especially those without family or social standing, were routinely ignored, punished, or locked away during labor. Their pain was dismissed as performance, their pleas for help treated as manipulation. Moral discipline and public order mattered more than suffering. There are documented cases where babies were born and died in locked rooms, yards, or even in outdoor sheds with staff refusing to intervene. Why did this happen? Partly, it was the culture of shame. Pregnancy outside marriage was considered a moral failing. Women who found themselves in such circumstances were blamed for their fate, seen as untrustworthy or unworthy of compassion. Institutions were designed to break the spirit, not nurture it. Matrons and wardens, often themselves former inmates, were conditioned to see empathy as weakness and rules as salvation. Punishment was routine, and isolation was the favored tool for breaking difficult women. But beneath the surface, there is another, deeper horror: the way institutions can turn ordinary people into participants in cruelty. The matron who locked the door might have believed she was maintaining order, teaching a lesson, upholding standards. She might even have convinced herself that the woman was faking. In the end, the system succeeded in doing what it was built to do: erase individuality, stifle protest, and deny responsibility. What became of the woman? Her name, if it was recorded at all, is lost among the lists of inmates and the faded death certificates of anonymous infants. She likely remained in the institution, her grief folded inward, her story never spoken aloud. For many women like her, such traumas were endured in silence, the scars invisible but enduring. Only much later, as reform swept through the world's orphanages and homes, did some of these stories come to light. Testimonies given to commissions, memoirs written in trembling hands, secret memories passed down through families. Today, some of the old laundries and workhouses still stand, now silent, their walls bearing the marks of lives lived and lost. Walk their corridors, and you might sense the presence of those who once suffered there, the echo of voices calling out for help that never came. We tell these stories not just to remember the pain, but to remind ourselves of the cost of indifference, the way a locked door, a turned key, or a single act of disbelief can change a life forever. In the end, the woman's tragedy is not just a personal loss, it is a warning from history about what happens when institutions forget their purpose, when society abandons its most vulnerable, and when a cry for help is met with a lock, a wall, and silence. If you listen, you can still hear her voice, pleading for help, for dignity, for the most basic act of human kindness. And in remembering, perhaps, we can make sure such stories are never allowed to happen again. The boy who lost his voice forever. In the hidden corridors of 19th century England, behind iron gates and barred windows, lay the bleakest outposts of social order, the workhouses and asylums built for those society could not or would not understand. It was here that the voiceless and forgotten were swept away, their names erased by bureaucracy, their pain hidden from polite company. Among the saddest stories to emerge from these walls is that of the boy who lost his voice forever, a tale not of illness or fate, but of cruelty so profound that it extinguished a young soul's will to be heard. His real name is lost to the records, replaced only with the chilling entry, John Doe, admitted, aged 9, mute and idiotic. He was not born voiceless, nor was he truly an idiot, as the crude medical language of the day insisted. Instead, he was a deaf child, born into poverty, his difference invisible to those who saw only misbehavior where there was simply silence. In the crowded city streets, his mother struggled to keep him safe, teaching him what signs she could, coaxing smiles and laughter from a boy whose world was shaped by gesture, not sound. But in Victorian England, difference was a threat. The rise of urban slums brought not sympathy, but suspicion. Children who did not speak or obey were labeled imbecile, feeble-minded, or deaf and dumb. No one asked why they could not answer, only why they would not. And so, one bitter winter morning, the boy was seized by parish authorities, dragged from his mother's arms, and consigned to the local workhouse for idiots and paupers. It was meant to be a place of care. It became a place of torment. The workhouse was a stone labyrinth. High walls, barred doors, and a silence broken only by orders barked and punishments dealt. Inside, the boy's world grew smaller still. The overseers, men hardened by years of poverty and authority, saw every unresponsiveness as defiance. When the boy failed to answer, he was struck. When he did not move at a command, he was whipped. No one noticed the frantic terror in his eyes, or the desperate way he tried to read their lips, to understand a language made only of pain. Every failure to obey was met with greater violence, until even the other children learned to fear his silence. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The boy, once bright-eyed and curious, learned to anticipate the sting of the cane. He stopped trying to make signs with his hands, stopped trying to explain himself to people who refused to see. Each time he flinched, the punishment only grew. So, he stopped flinching, stopped looking up. He became smaller, quieter, folding himself into the shadows, shrinking into corners where the cold seeped into his bones and the hunger gnawed at his stomach. Soon, the staff remarked, "He does not respond at all." They wrote it in their ledgers as proof of his idiocy. Catatonic, mute, lost to reason. What they had broken, they now declared to be broken by nature. A child who could not, would not, and, in their eyes, should not ever be part of the world outside these walls. But outside, rumors began to spread. A visiting inspector, more curious than most, took note of the boy during a rare tour. He saw the vacant stare, the unwashed face, the bruises that never seemed to fade. He asked why the child never spoke or moved. "He's just another idiot," the master replied. "Won't listen, won't learn." The inspector was not convinced. He pressed the staff. They shrugged, no use wasting kindness on the hopeless. No one had ever tried to teach the boy sign language, or to understand what lay behind his silence. The inspector's report went unnoticed for months. The workhouse's reputation for harshness was neither new nor unique. There were dozens, hundreds of places just like it, scattered across England and the wider empire. The idiot asylums, the imbecile wards, were dumping grounds for society's confusion and cruelty. Children who might have thrived with care were instead crushed beneath a system obsessed with discipline, obedience, and silence. The boy's condition never improved. In time, he stopped eating without being forced, stopped moving except when prodded or dragged. His eyes no longer met anyone's. He became a ghost within the walls, present but unreachable, the spark of his childhood extinguished by a world that refused to listen. When he finally died, of illness or starvation or simply despair, the record books noted only a name, a date, and the phrase, "never spoke a word." But in the years that followed, his story would become a symbol. Reformers, few and brave, began to demand change. They published pamphlets, lobbied Parliament, and pressed for inspections of the institutions where such tragedies flourished. The boy who lost his voice forever became a quiet rallying cry. What good is a civilization, they asked, that punishes a child for the crime of silence? What progress is there if empathy is trampled beneath the boots of authority? By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pressure from these voices forced change. Deaf schools and special education programs, painfully slow, often flawed, began to appear. Teachers learned sign language. Inspectors demanded proof of care, not just order. The boy's story, and those like his, faded into legend, but the lesson endured, that cruelty, unchecked, can kill not only the body, but the spirit. That the greatest injustice is not what is done in anger, but what is done in ignorance. Today, when you see a child who does not answer, or a person whose language is made of hands and silence, remember the boy who lost his voice forever. His story is not just about the past. It is a warning, a plea, and a measure of how far we have yet to go. For every lost voice, there is the possibility of being heard, if only someone will listen. The walls of the old workhouse still stand in some towns, now abandoned or turned to other uses. But sometimes, if you stand quietly in those empty halls, you might hear not silence, but the echo of a childhood cut short, a voice lost not to fate, but to the failure to understand. Let us never lose our own voices in the face of such suffering. Let us remember and speak and act for those who cannot. The inspector who risked his life. There are moments in history when a single act of courage changes the fate of thousands. But sometimes, the most dangerous acts of all happen in silence, in disguise, in the shadows between the powerful and the forgotten. This is the story of Mr. George Mayhew, a man who risked everything to reveal the truth behind the locked doors of England's infamous workhouses, and who very nearly paid for his courage with his life. It was the middle of the 19th century. Britain was a world power, building its empire on industry and invention. But beneath the surface of progress lay a reality most people chose not to see: the workhouse. These institutions, established by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, were meant to be the last refuge for the destitute, a place where those who had nothing could find shelter and a meal. But in truth, they became warehouses for the unwanted. Orphans, widows, the old and sick, and entire families broken by poverty. Conditions inside were intentionally harsh. The philosophy was simple: make life in the workhouse so miserable that only the truly desperate would seek its walls. George Mayhew was a journalist and reformer, known for his relentless pursuit of the stories others feared to tell. He believed that the truth about the workhouses could not be understood from the outside, so he resolved to go in. Disguised as a penniless laborer, clothes ragged, shoes cracked, Mayhew entered the labyrinth of England's workhouse system, not as a visitor, but as a prisoner of poverty. His true identity was known only to his editor and a single trusted friend. He carried nothing but a stub of pencil and a battered notebook, hidden inside his threadbare jacket. Inside, the reality was far worse than even the most lurid rumors. The air was heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, and despair. Men and women were separated by high stone walls, forbidden to speak or even look at each other. Meals consisted of watery gruel, sometimes moldy bread, and the rare scrap of boiled meat. The able-bodied were put to work breaking stones, picking oakum, or sewing until their fingers bled. Children learned to fear the sound of the matron's cane long before they learned to read. Punishments were swift and brutal. Talking out of turn, stealing a crust of bread, or falling behind in labor could earn a day in solitary confinement or worse. The sick and dying were left in cold, damp infirmaries with little more than a blanket and the company of rats. More than one pauper entered the workhouse never to emerge again. Mayhew scribbled everything he saw: daily routines, cruel punishments, whispered stories of lost children, the quiet heroism of those who tried to care for the weak when no one else would. He witnessed a young girl beaten for singing to her dying mother, an old soldier forced to crawl to his cot after collapsing at his labor, a child's burial performed at dawn with only the gravedigger as witness. At night, he huddled with the others, shivering against the cold, every sense on edge. But in these close quarters, suspicion was inevitable. The guards, the so-called masters of the workhouse, were always on the lookout for dissent, for spies, for anyone who might threaten their control. Mayhew's hands, though dirtied, were not those of a laborer. His questions were too pointed, his manner too observant. Rumors began to spread. The new man was not what he seemed. One evening, as Mayhew attempted to jot a note beneath his blanket, a sharp-eyed overseer caught the glint of his pencil. The notebook was seized. In a moment, the quiet misery of the ward exploded into violence. Guards dragged Mayhew from his bed, tearing his thin shirt, their voices rising in fury. They accused him of being a government spy, of plotting to shame the workhouse before Parliament. Threats of punishment and worse were shouted into his face. In the chaos, one guard raised a heavy stick, bringing it down on Mayhew's shoulder hard enough to fracture bone. But it was the discovery of Mayhew's real identity, uncovered in a desperate search for evidence among his possessions, that nearly cost him his life. The superintendent, realizing the scandal that could erupt if news of brutality leaked to London's newspapers, ordered that Mayhew be locked in a storage room until a decision could be made. The window was barred. Food and water were denied. Rumor spread through the wards that he would be taken out to the yard at night, a fate that had befallen troublesome inmates before. It was only the intervention of a sympathetic nurse, herself broken by years of service, who managed to slip a note to Mayhew's friend outside the walls. With time running out, the friend alerted authorities and influential allies in the press. Within days, an inspector arrived, backed by local police. Mayhew was found barely conscious, suffering from exposure and internal injuries, but alive. When his story was published, it caused a sensation. Readers in London, Manchester, and Edinburgh recoiled at the revelations. Graphic descriptions of starvation, violence, and casual cruelty. Public outrage turned to action. Parliamentary inquiries were launched. Conditions in workhouses across Britain were exposed to a scrutiny they had never faced. Some superintendents were dismissed. Rules were reformed. The worst abuses, for a time, were checked. But the scars on Mayhew's body and soul were permanent. He never fully recovered from his injuries. Yet, he continued to write, to campaign, to bear witness for the voiceless, reminding all who would listen that dignity and justice must belong even to the poorest among us. George Mayhew's journey into the heart of darkness is more than a single story of bravery. It is a testament to the power of witness, a reminder that the truth once revealed cannot be silenced by violence or buried behind stone walls. And it is a warning, too, that wherever power goes unchecked and the cries of the powerless are ignored, it takes just one person, willing to risk everything, to change the course of history. The legacy of Mayhew's sacrifice lives on, a challenge to all who inherit a world shaped by the courage of those who dared to look where others would not. The mass poisoning that was covered up. Let's travel back to the shadowed lanes of Devon, England, in the year 1880. It's a gray morning, rain flickering down the windows of the local workhouse, a building meant to be a refuge for the desperate and destitute, but in reality, a machine designed to grind down the poor into silent, obedient laborers. Inside, hundreds of men and women line up for breakfast, a scoop of steaming porridge, the day's one comfort in a world stripped of kindness. No one suspects that today their hunger will cost them their lives. Workhouses were notorious for their cruelty and cost-cutting. Meals were bland, nutrition was barely considered, and ingredients were bought in bulk at the cheapest rate. Food, especially for the poorest, was a numbers game. How many mouths could be filled with the least possible expense? The walls were whitewashed to hide mold and filth, using quicklime, a corrosive powder that burns skin, eyes, and lungs. Safety protocols barely existed. The kitchen was run by overworked staff, sometimes prisoners themselves. All it took was a single slip for disaster to slip into the daily routine. That morning, the cook prepared the oats as usual, scooping floury handfuls from sacks piled in a storeroom. No one noticed, until too late, that a batch had been stored beside the quicklime. It had happened before in other workhouses. Lime dust floating onto food, sacks getting swapped, no one caring enough to check. The lime was supposed to keep the walls white, the place sanitary, but mixed with oats, it became a slow, invisible killer. As the porridge was served, there was a strange taste. Some inmates grimaced, but few dared complain. To refuse food was to court punishment or starvation. So they swallowed it down. Within hours, the workhouse was in chaos. People doubled over with pain, searing cramps, violent vomiting, mouths and throats burning as if they'd swallowed fire. Some collapsed outright. Doctors were summoned, but even as 6 inmates died, the staff offered little more than chalk and water, the standard remedy for indigestion. The horror did not stop at death. The official inquiry began almost immediately. Families of the dead demanded answers. Survivors whispered of the taste, the agony, the speed with which some were carried away to the infirmary and never returned. But when the coroner arrived, the verdict was swift, chilling, and utterly false. The cause of death was indigestion. No mention of poison, no autopsy, no samples taken from the porridge. For the authorities, the truth was a threat to the fragile facade of care and charity. For the workhouse board, the risk was clear. Better to bury the facts with the bodies than face public outrage, lawsuits, or closure. And so, the deaths were hidden behind paperwork and official silence. The cook kept his job. The staff, some racked by guilt, stayed quiet or left. The incident slipped from the newspapers after a single, ambiguous headline. But among the inmates, the truth would not die. Survivors told anyone who would listen. The oats tasted of lime. They killed us and lied. Some, scarred for life by what they'd ingested, smuggled out letters to reformers and journalists. It took years and pressure from those outside the workhouse system before the truth finally surfaced. An inspector, following up on another case of contamination, found the old storerooms and the lime sacks. He interviewed ex-staff who had nothing left to lose. He compared records and read between the lines of the coroner's bland report. It was undeniable. The oats had been mixed, whether by accident or neglect, with lime intended for walls, not bellies. The deaths were not just a tragedy, but a symptom of a system built on carelessness and cruelty. Why was this allowed to happen? Why did no one care enough to stop it, or even to properly mourn the dead? Because in the eyes of the era, workhouse inmates were not citizens, but statistics. The poor were blamed for their own suffering, and institutions were obsessed with appearances. To admit fault was to risk scandal. To risk scandal was to risk the whole system. The machine protected itself. The voices of the dead were smothered by bureaucracy. But history remembers what official records try to hide. The Devon workhouse poisoning is not just a footnote, but a warning. When human beings become numbers, when systems value order over truth, disasters will always follow. Behind every bland indigestion verdict is a story of pain, of fear, of voices crying out for justice and being denied. The whitewashed walls could not contain the truth forever. Today we read these stories and feel the chill of history echo through time. We see the faces of the 6 who died for a bowl of porridge, and the many more who suffered in silence. Their names may be lost, but their story is not. In every institution that hides its failures, in every system that protects itself at the expense of the vulnerable, their memory endures. So, next time you hear an official explanation that doesn't ring true, remember the Devon workhouse. Remember the tainted oats, the silent deaths, and the lie that was called indigestion. Justice sometimes is just the truth finally being spoken, no matter how many years it takes for the walls to crumble and the real story to seep out. The blind man forced to break stones. There are stories that seem too cruel to be real, stories that, if not for the cold facts recorded in ledgers and the faded testimonies of survivors, would sound like Gothic nightmares rather than the day-to-day workings of civilization. Tonight, we step into one of those stories, the account of an elderly blind man, battered by fate and bureaucracy, who was forced to break stones for the road, a punishment designed for the able-bodied, but inflicted on the vulnerable until there was little left but blood, pleading, and silence. It happened in the late 19th century, in one of the countless British workhouses that dotted the countryside and city slums alike. These workhouses, grim brick fortresses designed more for deterrence than charity, housed society's unwanted, orphans, widows, the disabled, the sick, the old, and anyone whose poverty became an inconvenience. The ideal was less eligibility, the idea that life inside must always be harsher than life outside, lest the poor become too comfortable and too numerous. Our story begins with the arrival of a man named Owen, though his real name is lost to the mists of bureaucratic shorthand and fading ink. He was nearly 70, blind for more than a decade, led into the institution by the hand of a neighbor after the last of his family died and his savings ran out. The matron who took him in noted, infirm, blind, without occupation, and assigned him to a small, drafty room near the men's ward. At first, Owen's days were spent in silence and darkness. He listened to the scrape of bowls, the coughs of the dying, the soft footfalls of other inmates as they groped their way through the maze of corridors. His blindness rendered him invisible to most of the staff, someone to be moved, cleaned, and fed, but never truly seen. But as the workhouse population swelled that winter, the guardians grew desperate for more hands. The roadwork contract, laying new stones for the muddy lanes that cut through town, brought in a few shillings for the parish, but only if every able-bodied man was put to labor. There were quotas, there were punishments, and there were few who dared question orders. In a cold, echoing hall, Owen was dragged from his cot one morning and placed at a pile of broken granite, a sledgehammer shoved into his trembling hands. He could not see the stones, could barely lift the hammer, but the order was simple and absolute. Break the stones or spend the night in the punishment cell. The punishment cell, the very word sent fear through the ranks of inmates. It was a stone closet, windowless, with only a slop bucket and a straw mat. So cold in winter that breath froze on the walls, so damp in summer that mold crawled up from the floor. To survive the night inside was to court sickness, madness, or both. Owen, who had once worked as a fiddler in village inns, who could not see the mallet in his hand or the blood that welled beneath his torn fingernails, was terrified. And so he swung the hammer. Hour after hour, day after day, the hammer fell. Owen struck blindly, sometimes hitting the stones, sometimes the ground, sometimes his own hands. The other men tried to help, slipping him the larger stones, whispering encouragement. But the warder watched with cold eyes, barking orders, indifferent to the groans of pain. Owen's hands grew raw, then blistered, then split open entirely. Blood smeared the stones, dried on his cuffs, leaked down his wrists. Still, the orders never changed. Break the stones or be locked away. At night, Owen pleaded for mercy. "I cannot see," he told the warder. "My hands bleed. I can barely hold the hammer." The reply was always the same. "Then work harder, old man, or face the cell." In the silence of his cot, he wrapped his hands in scraps of old linen, feeling the sticky crust of scabs and the sharp ache of exposed nerves. But every morning, he was dragged back to the pile, forced to start again. Weeks blurred into months. Winter became spring, and still the torment continued. Owen's health declined. He grew thinner, more withdrawn. Some days he collapsed by the pile of stones, the hammer slipping from numb fingers, the blood pooling beneath his hand. The staff shrugged. "He's just lazy," they said. "He wants special treatment." The other inmates grew restless, some with pity, others with fear, knowing that any sign of rebellion could bring the same fate upon themselves. Once, a visiting parish official paused to ask about the old blind man with the bandaged hands. The master of the workhouse replied, "He must work, as all must, no exceptions." The official nodded and moved on. To question the system was to question the very fabric of social order. Why did this happen? Why was a blind man, clearly unfit for heavy labor, forced into such cruelty? Part of the answer lies in the rules and psychology of the era. The poor laws were built on suspicion, that poverty was the result of moral failing, In this logic, even the weakest were made to suffer, if only to maintain the discipline of the whole. There was also something deeper, a bureaucratic blindness that mirrored Owen's own, a refusal to see the humanity of those suffering under its rule. The staff were not monsters. They were simply cogs in a machine designed for efficiency, not empathy. To show mercy was to break ranks, to risk their own standing, to invite chaos into an ordered world. And so, the hammer kept swinging, the stones kept breaking, and the old man bled in silence. In the end, Owen's story ends as so many did, in exhaustion, collapse, and a death that was recorded as natural causes. No inquiry was held, no reforms were made. His body was buried in a pauper's grave, unmarked, his suffering quickly forgotten by those who had enforced it. But for those who worked beside him, for the handful who dared remember, the story lived on. A quiet indictment. A ghost that haunted the corridors long after the workhouse closed its doors. Today, the stones Owen broke may still lie beneath a quiet lane, their sharp edges worn smooth by time and rain. The workhouses are mostly gone, their walls crumbling or repurposed into flats and shops. But if you walk those roads at dusk, you might feel the weight of history pressing in, the echo of a hammer falling, the whisper of hands that once bled unseen. Owen's story, like so many others, reminds us that the true measure of a society is not how it treats its strongest, but how it endures, or ignores, the suffering of those it cannot see. To look away is easy, to remember is harder, and to tell these stories is to keep alive the fragile hope that we might learn, at last, to see each other clearly. Even in the darkest corridors, even among the broken stones, children punished for playing. In the cold heart of Victorian England, where the sharp lines of industry cut deep into the fabric of family and childhood, there stood institutions that promised relief from poverty, but delivered something far colder: the workhouse. It was here, behind tall stone walls and barred windows, that the innocence of childhood was not merely lost, but deliberately broken. In this world, the simple act of play, a burst of laughter, a game improvised from scraps, became a rebellion. For the children locked inside, joy itself was a forbidden crime. The story of the two boys caught playing is a true tale, echoing from countless workhouse records and memoirs. It begins not in an act of mischief, but in a desperate, fleeting attempt to reclaim a piece of humanity. The workhouse was designed to be a place of discipline, where every moment was regimented, every movement watched. Children were separated from their parents and lined up by age and sex. The daily routine was unyielding. Rise before dawn, labor in silence, eat what was given, and speak only when spoken to. Laughter, like warmth or affection, was rationed until it all but disappeared. But children, by nature, resist the world's attempts to make them small. In the yard, during a rare and tightly controlled break, two boys, no older than 8 or 9, found themselves with a pair of ragged cloth scraps left over from the tailoring room. They knotted the bits together, inventing a crude ball, and for a few precious minutes they ran and played, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. For a moment, the gray world flickered with color. It did not last. An overseer, charged with maintaining order, saw their game. In the twisted logic of the workhouse, play was not harmless, it was subversive. Joy meant distraction. Distraction meant rebellion. If one child played, others might follow, and the delicate machinery of discipline would falter. The overseer stormed across the yard, his boots striking the flagstones like a drumbeat of doom. He seized the boys by their collars, dragging them to the master's office. The punishment was swift and brutal. The boys were accused of idleness, of wasting valuable cloth, and, worst of all, of exciting disorder among the other children. Their pleas went unheard. The law of the workhouse was clear. Any act that threatened the smooth operation of the institution must be crushed. The sentence was 10 lashes each, administered with a leather strap before the assembled children. The boys' cries, muffled by fear and humiliation, rang through the hall. When the lashes were finished, they were denied food for a day, forced to sit in silence as the others ate their meager rations, their hunger a further lesson in obedience. The message was not lost on the other children. Word spread quickly. Play was rebellion, laughter was forbidden, and joy would be punished. The walls seemed to grow higher, the air colder, as if the building itself conspired to erase all memory of childhood. In the nights that followed, some children wept quietly in their beds, not just for the pain of their friends, but for the loss of something precious they could not name. But why such cruelty? Why was play, so essential to the spirit of a child, seen as a crime? The answer lies in the philosophy that underpinned the workhouse system itself. The Poor Law, reformed in 1834, was built on the belief that poverty was a moral failing, that discipline and deprivation would correct the poor and make them useful to society. In this worldview, even children were suspect. Idleness was the enemy, and the antidote was endless labor, silence, and submission. Play was not merely a waste of time. It was a seed of disorder, a reminder that the poor might one day dream of something better. The records from the era are filled with similar stories. Children punished for singing, for drawing faces in the dust, for whispering in the corridors. Every act of creativity, every flicker of imagination, was met with suspicion and, more often than not, pain. Inspectors, when they visited, sometimes recorded the marks left by the strap or the hollow eyes of children too frightened to look up. But more often, they looked the other way. The discipline of the workhouse, they reasoned, was necessary for the greater good. Yet, not everyone accepted this. In time, reformers began to speak out. Teachers, doctors, and a handful of politicians who dared to suggest that children needed more than food and shelter. They needed space to grow, to learn, to play. Reports emerged of workhouses where children's laughter was heard again, where small gardens were planted and games allowed, if only for a few moments each day. But change came slowly, and for many it was too late. The story of the two boys, like so many others, faded into the gray of official records, their names lost, their laughter silenced. But their legacy endured. The workhouse system, exposed by scandal and softened by the demands of a changing world, was eventually dismantled. Laws were passed to protect children from such cruelty, to recognize that play is not a luxury, but a necessity of childhood. Today, the workhouse walls still stand in some places, repurposed as museums or apartments. But if you walk their corridors at dusk, you might hear, beneath the echoes of daily life, the faintest sound, a child's laughter, sudden and defiant, rising up against the silence. It is a reminder that joy, once forbidden, can never be fully erased. The punishment of those boys was meant to break their spirits, to teach them that obedience was more important than happiness. But even in their suffering, they revealed a deeper truth, that the human heart, especially the heart of a child, will always seek out the light, even in the darkest of places. And that is a lesson worth remembering, long after the last lash has faded and the world outside has changed. The baby left in a coal cell, beneath the towering smokestacks and iron gates of the Victorian Workhouse. Some of the darkest tragedies in modern history played out not in public, but behind locked doors. Unwitnessed, unremembered, save by those left with the scars. In these vast, overcrowded institutions, the innocent suffered most. Children born to poverty and misfortune became numbers on a ledger, faces in a crowded nursery, tiny lives entrusted to a system that was stretched, strained, and too often indifferent. The story of the baby left in a coal cell is not a single isolated event, but a symbol, aching and unforgettable, of the cost when the world turns its gaze away from the most vulnerable. The workhouse nursery was supposed to be a place of refuge. In practice, it was a room overwhelmed by need. By the late 1800s, urban poverty was at its worst, and the intake of infants and toddlers soared to unsustainable levels. Rows of iron cots lined the walls, packed so tightly that nurses could barely pass between. The air was thick with the cries of the hungry, the ill, the simply lonely. Children who had lost their mothers to fever, or whose parents could no longer feed another mouth. Overworked attendants did what they could, but the ratio was hopeless. Sometimes one nurse for 40 or 50 infants, forced to triage their care in a constant storm of demands. Mistakes in such a setting were not just possible, but inevitable. Names blurred, faces became interchangeable, and in the chaos of daily routines, it was easy for a single silent baby to become invisible. The day in question began with a flurry of movement. An outbreak of illness in another ward had forced a sudden relocation of all the nursery's children and their few possessions. The order was given to move quickly. No time for records, just a frantic bundling of swaddled infants and sobbing toddlers into the arms of flustered staff. Cots were stripped, blankets gathered, and in the confusion, one small bundle was left behind. A 6-month-old boy, sleeping soundly after a rare moment of calm, had been tucked away near the back wall, out of sight of the nurse who counted the cots. As the doors banged shut, he did not stir. The hours that followed passed unnoticed by most. The nursery attendants, overwhelmed by the chaos of resettling dozens of frightened children, never realized a head count had come up short. The older children, wide-eyed and scared, could not name the missing face. Outside, the weather turned cold and damp, a bitter reminder of the winter's reach. It was not until late afternoon, when a matron making her rounds noticed an empty cot, that the alarm was raised. Panic spread through the ward as nurses and attendants searched every corner. The laundry, the kitchens, the outhouses, calling for the missing infant. Each passing minute brought a new wave of dread. In the workhouse, children sometimes vanished. Mothers claimed them in desperate escapes. Illness took them suddenly, or in rare cases, someone simply forgot. Then, a scullery maid, fetching coal for the kitchen fires, heard a faint, uneven sound, a thin, whimpering cry, half muffled by stone and darkness. The coal cell was a cramped, airless shed behind the kitchens, used to store the black fuel that powered the workhouse's endless machines. The door, heavy and warped, had swung shut after a morning delivery, trapping the chill and the thick dust inside. When the maid forced it open, her lantern revealed the source, the missing baby, half buried in coal dust, face gray with cold, and breathing in short, shallow gasps. He had been left there by accident, perhaps set down for a moment as a nurse tended another child, perhaps carried by a distracted worker and forgotten in the confusion of the move. No one ever remembered or dared to confess. What mattered was that he had spent hours alone in the dark, shivering, struggling for breath, lungs filling with the fine black dust that choked the air. The rescue was frantic. The baby was rushed to the infirmary, where a doctor did what little he could, wrapping the child in warm blankets, trying to clear the soot from his lungs, rubbing tiny hands to coax back life. Word spread quickly through the workhouse, and even the most hardened inmates and staff were shaken by the sight. An innocent, nearly lost to the machinery of neglect. For days, the entire institution held its breath. Miraculously, the child survived, though he would carry a rasping cough for years, a living reminder, wheezing in the hallways of what had happened. The scandal, of course, was hushed. No official report was filed, no staff punished. The incident became another whispered warning among the nursery workers. Be careful, count twice, never assume the baby is sleeping where you last saw him. Mothers in the women's ward clung tighter to their infants, terrified that their child might be the next to vanish in the cracks of the institution's routine. Some, haunted by the story, would risk escape and poverty on the streets rather than entrust their children to the workhouse's indifferent care. But outside those walls, the world remained largely indifferent. The parliamentary inquiries into workhouse conditions produced mountains of paperwork, but little real change. Reports described overcrowding, illness, poor ventilation, but rarely lingered on the heartbreak of a single missing child. Reformers fought for stricter oversight, better training, more staff. But for every improvement, 1,000 small, unseen tragedies went unrecorded. The baby left in a coal cell was neither the first nor the last victim of a system designed to survive, not to nurture. In faded ledgers and hospital records, stories like his appear as mere footnotes. Infant, exposure, survived. Child, dust inhalation, partial recovery. Yet, behind every entry is a real beating heart, a future nearly snuffed out by a moment's inattention, a life that might have been lost to darkness and dust. Today, as we look back on the era of the workhouse with a mix of horror and disbelief, the story of the coal cell remains urgent. It is a reminder that no system, however well-intentioned or necessary, can ever replace the watchful care owed to every child. It warns us that bureaucracy, routine, and exhaustion can be as deadly as malice when innocence is at stake. So the next time you pass a nursery or see a child sleeping, remember this story. Remember the baby who waited in darkness for someone to remember him. Let his survival be more than a cautionary tale. Let it be a summons to vigilance, compassion, and the refusal to ever let the smallest among us become invisible, lost in the shadows between duty and love. The woman who went insane from isolation. In the suffocating halls of the Victorian Workhouse, where every comfort was rationed and silence pressed in like a second skin, the greatest crime a woman could commit was to speak up. The system was built on discipline, on obedience, on the belief that poverty was a symptom of moral weakness, and that only the strictest regimens could cure it. But some women, battered by loss and hunger, found in themselves a final spark of courage, a willingness to question, to challenge, to refuse humiliation. And for one such woman, that spark became the beginning of a descent into darkness from which there would be no return. Her name is lost to history. She appears only as M in the brittle workhouse registers of Northern England, an initial that stands for hundreds, perhaps thousands of women like her. She was not a thief, nor a drunkard, nor an incorrigible, as the poor law officers like to say. She was, in the words of one matron, troublesome, which meant she noticed too much, cared too deeply, and was not afraid to make her complaints heard. The particular outrage that marked her for punishment was food, the meager rations of stale bread and watery gruel, the weevils that sometimes floated in the soup, the spoiled meat passed off as Sunday dinner. Others grumbled quietly, afraid of retribution. But she raised her voice in the yard and at the dining table, demanding better for the women and children around her. The authorities had little patience for dissent. Workhouse discipline was enforced with military precision, rules for walking, for eating, for sleeping, for speaking. To question the system was to threaten the very foundation of its power. In a world that pathologized female resistance as madness, there was a convenient word for women like her: hysterical. It was a diagnosis with no cure, a label that transformed protest into proof of mental instability. On a cold morning, with the sky the color of lead, she was summoned before the master and the matron. Her voice still trembling with rage and exhaustion, she repeated her accusations about the food. She was told to apologize. She refused. What happened next was recorded in the punishment log. Isolated, cell, 40 days, unruly conduct, signs of mania. The decision was final. There was no trial, no appeal. She was led through the echoing corridors to a tiny stone-walled cell at the far end of the building, its only window so high and small that even sunlight seemed to enter in chains. Solitary confinement was the most feared of all workhouse punishments. The silence was absolute. Meals were slid through a hatch, sometimes left untouched for hours. No voices, no footsteps, no comfort of human touch or familiar faces, just the endless tick of her own heartbeat, and the darkness that thickened with every day. The system believed isolation would break the will of the defiant, teach humility through deprivation. But isolation does not teach, it unravels. The mind, starved of company and meaning, begins to fold in on itself. Memories blur, thoughts repeat. The border between waking and dreams dissolves. 40 days. The number itself is a mythic sentence, biblical in its cruelty, endless to a soul left alone. There is no record of how she marked the passing of time. Did she scratch days into the stone? Did she pray? Did she plead with the darkness, with her jailers, with the God she must have once trusted? Or did her thoughts splinter into fragments, each one echoing off the damp walls until nothing remained but the rhythm of breath and hunger and fear. When at last the cell was opened, she did not rise. The matron found her sitting in the corner, hair tangled, eyes wide and unfocused, lips moving in silent repetition. She did not know her name when asked. She did not recognize the faces of the other women who tried to greet her. At first, they said she was merely stubborn, that a night's rest would restore her wits. But the next day, and the day after, her mind remained locked away. Her speech dissolved into gibberish, her memories scattered like ashes. The workhouse doctor, called to assess her, pronounced her incurably deranged, unfit for labor or company. The old label, hysteria, was quietly replaced with a new one, insanity. She was transferred, as so many women were, to the county asylum, an even bleaker fortress on the edge of town. There, she joined the ranks of the forgotten, the mad, the ruined, the ones whose only crime was refusing to be silent. The asylum registers list her only by her first initial, a blank space where her story should be. Her family, if she had any, were never notified. Her grave, when it came, was marked only by a number, but the story did not die with her. Word spread among the workhouse women, who lowered their voices but not their anger. Some whispered that her ghost haunted the solitary cell, that on certain nights her voice could be heard, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing, sometimes chanting the same words she had once used to demand justice. Her fate became a cautionary tale, but also a rallying cry. Do not trust those who call your pain madness. Do not let them seal you away. For historians, her life is a fragment, a single thread in the tapestry of institutional cruelty that defined the Victorian era. But for those who still study the workhouse system, her suffering remains a chilling reminder of how easily the voices of women were silenced, how quickly righteous anger was labeled disease, and how devastating the consequences of that silence could be. Her story is not just a relic of a forgotten past. It is a warning that when society calls protest insanity, the cost is not only justice, but the very soul of the one who dared to speak. In the end, her name may be lost, her voice nearly erased, but the memory of her courage and her suffering lingers in every stone of the buildings that once caged her. The woman who went insane from isolation is a shadow behind every story of resistance, proof that sometimes to speak up is to risk everything, but to remain silent is to let injustice triumph. She was punished for caring, for noticing, for demanding dignity. In her silence, we hear the echo of all who have been locked away, and in her memory, we find the strength to keep telling the truth, no matter the cost. The orphan who cleaned until he collapsed. Imagine a child named John. He is 10 years old, with dirt caked in the lines of his hands and hope already fading from his eyes. John is not the child of a prosperous home, nor even a loved orphan placed with a gentle family. He is a number, an entry in a ledger, one of thousands shunted off to the bleak stone walls of a Victorian workhouse. In this place, he will learn, every hour, every day, that mercy is rare, and that even children can become machines. John's day begins long before dawn, roused by the rattling of keys and the bark of a matron's order. The air is cold, bitter cold, the kind that makes fingers numb and lips crack. There is no fire in the boys' dormitory, just rows of beds with thin blankets and the stink of unwashed bodies. Before he is fully awake, John is sent to work, his first task already waiting. The endless scrubbing of floors. Imagine the scene. John, shoulders hunched, gripping a brush nearly as big as his forearm. He kneels on stone, pushing water and soap across flagstones that have seen generations of suffering. His knees ache, his wrists throb. The skin on his hands, exposed to lye and icy water, splits and bleeds, but he keeps working. In a Victorian workhouse, the clock is an enemy. Every minute of rest is a minute stolen from useful labor. 14 hours. That's how long John scrubs, day after day, with barely a break for the watery gruel that passes as a meal. Each hour blurs into the next. Overseers watch, sticks in hand, ready to strike a boy who slacks. There is no singing, no laughter, no camaraderie. Only the sound of brushes scraping stone and the heavy tread of boots. John was an orphan like so many others, his parents dead or lost to poverty, his childhood traded for a roof and a crust of bread. In the eyes of the system, work would save him. It would turn him from a burden into a productive cog. But all it did was wear him down. His frame was slight, ribs sharp beneath thin skin. The food was never enough. Hunger gnawed at his belly, exhaustion at his bones. One bitter winter night, John's body finally failed him. The chill in the corridor was fierce, the kind that freezes breath mid-air. He had been cleaning for hours, head bowed, knuckles raw. As midnight approached, his vision blurred. He tried to stand, but dizziness overcame him. He swayed, stumbled, and fell, striking his head with a sickening crack on the iron grate meant to heat the endless halls. He did not rise. The other children froze, knowing that even to help him might bring punishment. It was the night watchman who found him, crumpled and bleeding, skin ghostly pale. The doctor was summoned, a man as stern as the stone walls themselves. He looked at John, did not check his pulse, did not clean his wound, did not even kneel beside him. Instead, he pronounced the verdict that haunted workhouses across Britain. Lazy and underfed, he brought it on himself. The next morning, John was dead. The death certificate did not mention exhaustion, exposure, or starvation. It blamed natural causes. In the workhouse, the staff shrugged. The doctor's word was final, and to question it was to threaten your own place. John was buried in a pauper's grave, one among many. The dirt quickly tamped down, the space soon filled by another desperate soul. How did it come to this? The workhouse system, born of the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, was supposed to be a last resort, a safety net for the poorest of the poor. But in practice, it became a machine for punishment, a warning to anyone who might fall behind in the new industrial order. Children were especially vulnerable. Orphaned by disease, war, or the grinding poverty of city life, they became the labor force of last resort, cheap, silent, and expendable. The doctrine was simple. Work would cure poverty, and discipline would save the soul. But for children like John, discipline meant endless, pointless toil. Food was rationed to the edge of starvation. Punishments were swift and brutal. Every authority, from the matron to the doctor, saw emotion as weakness, need as criminal, and death as just another ledger entry. John's story is not unique. Reports from the time are filled with accounts of children collapsing from overwork, of boys driven to desperation, of girls forced to work with bleeding hands. Inspectors, reformers, and a few courageous doctors would sometimes speak out. Charles Dickens wrote about these injustices in novels that still sting the conscience. But the system changed slowly, and for every voice raised in protest, there were hundreds of Johns whose suffering was never recorded, who died so quietly that the world barely noticed. What was lost in those halls was not just a life, but the possibility of a life. John could have been anything: a poet, a craftsman, a father, a friend. But in the ledger of the workhouse, he was only a number: laborer, lazy, dead. Even today, the story of John lingers in the crumbling stones of old workhouses, in the records gathering dust, in the unmarked graves of the forgotten. His story is a warning. When a society measures children by their usefulness and blames the weak for their suffering, tragedy follows. The lesson is simple, but it must be learned again and again. Compassion is not weakness, and no child should ever have to work until he falls. If you pass an old workhouse, pause and listen. The stones remember, and somewhere in the hush of winter air, you might hear the ghost of a child's brush, still scrubbing, still hoping, still waiting for someone to say, enough. The time the workers revolted. There are moments in history when the oppressed, forced for years to swallow their rage, suddenly refused to bend any longer. In 19th century Britain, these moments were rare and always dangerous. For those at the bottom, defiance could mean starvation, violence, or being erased from society altogether. Yet sometimes, the urge to resist becomes stronger than the instinct to survive. One cold morning in 1842, inside the walls of the Liverpool workhouse, the unthinkable happened. The workers rose up, risking everything against a system built to break them. Their revolt, its brutal suppression, and its secret aftermath would echo for years, a lesson written in bruises, silence, and ships bound for a far-off land. The Liverpool workhouse in the 1840s was a fortress of suffering. Designed under the infamous New Poor Law, it was a place not of refuge, but of last resort, a stone and iron warning to the poor that only the desperate should enter. The men and women who lived within its walls had lost everything: family, home, hope, and finally, freedom. Rules governed every hour, every mouthful of food, every movement. Men and women were separated, children taken from mothers and the able-bodied forced into hard labor, breaking stones, picking oakum, or toiling in the yards from dawn until dusk. Discipline was enforced by the workhouse masters and their guards, often men who had themselves once hovered on the brink of poverty, now determined to prove their loyalty through unflinching obedience. The slightest infraction could mean hours in the punishment cell, a meal withheld, or a beating administered in front of all. But in 1842, the mood inside the Liverpool workhouse grew darker than usual. Food rations were cut again, the work became more punishing, and rumors swirled that new contracts would mean even longer hours for the same miserable pay. It was during this bleak spring that the spark finally caught. One morning, as the bell rang to summon the men to the workyard, a hush fell over the assembled ranks. No one moved. For the first time in living memory, the chain of silent suffering broke. Instead of shuffling forward, the workers stood together, shoulders set, eyes fixed on the masters. Someone, history doesn't record who, called out, "No more!" The guards hesitated, sensing the mood shift. Then another voice, "We won't be worked like dogs." The guards shouted threats. Still, no one moved. The standoff grew tense. To the staff, this was not just insubordination. It was a challenge to their authority, a threat to the very order of the workhouse system. The headmaster barked an order, and the guards waded in with truncheons and fists. The first blows landed on an old weaver, who crumpled at their feet. Then a younger man tried to shield him and was clubbed into silence. Panic erupted. Some tried to flee, others tried to fight back with bare hands or shards of stone from the workyard. But the guards had numbers, weapons, and the law on their side. By the end of the day, several men lay unconscious on the stone floor, blood pooling beneath their heads. The rest were herded into the dormitories, doors barred, rations cut even further. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said men had been killed, others that a second revolt was being planned. But the workhouse masters were determined to crush any hint of rebellion. Over the next days, 3 men, the ones they deemed ringleaders, were quietly singled out. They were not brought to trial, nor allowed to defend themselves. Instead, they were taken in the dead of night, shackled and loaded onto a cart under armed guard, their destination unknown to the rest. Their journey ended at the Liverpool docks, where a convict ship waited. The men were handed over to colonial authorities with barely a word of explanation. Incorrigible, read the charge sheet. They joined the long line of Britain's unwanted, transported thousands of miles to the prison colonies of Australia. There, their names vanished into a sea of forced labor, disease, and silence. No one in Liverpool ever saw them again. Inside the workhouse, the revolt was never spoken of openly. To do so was to invite suspicion or worse. But the story endured in whispers, passed from bunk to bunk at night, kept alive by those who remembered the price of standing together, even for a single morning. The old men who had watched the beating and the secret exile never forgot the look in the eyes of the guards. Fear, anger, and a flicker of shame. Some wondered if the revolt had changed anything. The work was just as hard, the rules just as strict, and the punishment even harsher than before. But for a brief moment, the workers had seen what solidarity looked like, and it burned a hole through the stone-cold certainty of the workhouse regime. Historians piecing together the events of 1842 have found only scattered evidence: the terse minutes of workhouse boards, brief notices of transported troublemakers, and the silence in the official record where details ought to be. What is clear is that such revolts were rare and dangerous, that the poor law authorities preferred erasure over reform, and that punishment was often meted out in secrecy, far from the eyes of the press or public. Why did the workers revolt? Hunger and exhaustion, yes. The daily indignities and the knowledge that nothing would ever get better. But above all, a sense that they had nothing left to lose. When suffering becomes routine, when hope is forbidden, sometimes all that remains is defiance. For those 3 men sent to Australia, defiance meant exile and oblivion. For the others, it meant a story, a fleeting memory of courage in the face of overwhelming power. Today, the Liverpool workhouse is gone, its walls replaced by shops and housing. But the lessons of that spring in 1842 remain. Power can crush rebellion, silence witnesses, and erase names. But the spirit that drove those men to say no more cannot be fully buried, Every act of resistance, however brief, leaves its mark on history, on memory, and on the future we build from the ruins of the past. The girl who died of shame. In the shadows of Victorian England's workhouses, beneath the rigid order and cold charity, unfolded tragedies so silent and devastating that many never left the stone walls where they occurred. These were places built not for healing, but for correction, not for kindness, but for discipline so severe that even the smallest act of rebellion was met with punishment designed to wound the soul as much as the body. This is the story of Ellen, the girl who died of shame, a tale that echoes in the silence left behind by all those forgotten by history, and a warning to every age about the consequences of cruelty disguised as order. Ellen was 15, on the edge between childhood and adulthood, a time when dreams should be growing and the future should still shimmer with possibility. She had not been born into the workhouse, but life's misfortunes, illness, poverty, perhaps the loss of a parent, had led her through its gates, as it did for so many children whose only crime was to have no one left to care for them. Inside, the workhouse was a world apart. The rules were relentless, the discipline absolute, and every waking hour was marked by surveillance and silence. For a girl of Ellen's age, the women's ward was a place of grim routine and even grimmer lessons. Older women, their spirits bent by years of hardship, enforced the matron's will with whispered warnings and sharp looks. Girls were taught to work and to obey, to keep their heads down and their voices quiet. Any show of spirit, any sign of independence, was not simply frowned upon, but crushed, for the smallest spark of rebellion threatened the entire machinery of order that kept the workhouse running. Ellen's crime was a small one, almost laughable in its innocence by modern eyes. One evening, exhausted from hours of scrubbing, she answered back to the matron, perhaps a plea for fairness or a moment of exasperation escaping her lips. In that moment, the matron's eyes hardened. The rules were clear. Insolence would not be tolerated. To answer back, to challenge the authority of those in power, was seen not only as disrespect, but as a kind of infection that had to be stamped out lest it spread. The punishment was swift, public, and designed to break Ellen's spirit. Her head was shaved, a punishment borrowed from ancient times, meant to humiliate and erase the self. The act itself was brutal. Ellen was brought to the front of the ward, forced to kneel, and as the women and girls looked on in shock and fear, the matron took the shears to her hair, stripping away not just her curls, but her dignity, her sense of self, and her last fragile shield against the cruelty around her. But the ordeal did not end there. The matron ordered Ellen to walk, bawled and weeping, through the women's ward. The other inmates, themselves broken by years of humiliation, laughed, not out of malice, but out of fear and the desperate need to distance themselves from the next victim. To be the object of laughter in that world was to be marked, isolated, stripped of whatever small comfort community might have provided. In that moment, Ellen was utterly alone, exposed, mocked, and shamed for the simple crime of speaking her mind. The echoes of that humiliation lingered long after the laughter faded. Ellen was left with nothing but her apron and a cell-like bed in the corner of the ward. No comfort was offered, no apology made. Shame, once planted, grew quickly in such barren soil. In the darkness of that night, her mind must have replayed every snip of the shears, every whisper, every glance of pity or scorn. For a 15-year-old girl, stripped not only of her hair, but of her hope and belonging, the weight of shame was simply too much to bear. The next morning, Ellen was found hanging by her apron, her one remaining possession. Her life ended by her own hand. The workhouse registers recorded her death in a single clinical line: deceased, self-inflicted. There was no mention of the punishment, no record of the laughter, no acknowledgement of the pain that had driven her to such a desperate act. But news of her death did not stay within the workhouse walls. Rumors spread, as they always did, first among the inmates, then in the parish, and finally to the ears of the reformers and journalists who, even in those days, fought to shine a light into the darkest corners of British society. The story of Ellen, the girl who died of shame, became a symbol of the violence done in the name of discipline, of the way institutions designed to protect the vulnerable could become engines of suffering. Ellen's story is not unique. The Victorian workhouses were full of girls and boys whose names and fates are lost, but whose suffering was real and devastating. To punish with humiliation is to wound a person's very sense of self. To turn a community against one of its own is to create a loneliness that can be fatal. Ellen's death became one of many small sparks that fueled calls for reform. The cruelty of head shaving and public shaming, along with countless other punishments, began to draw condemnation. Over time, these voices would help dismantle the system that had claimed so many young lives. Today, the old workhouse walls still stand in some places, silent monuments to a past both distant and dangerously close. For every Ellen whose story is known, there are countless others whose pain remains buried beneath the stone. As we remember her, we are reminded that shame is a weapon as deadly as any other, and that the true measure of a society is how it treats those with the least power. Ellen's voice was silenced, but her story speaks still. It tells us to guard against cruelty, to refuse to let the laughter of the crowd drown out the pain of the individual, and to remember that the wounds we inflict in the name of order or discipline can last far longer than the moment in which they are dealt. The girl who died of shame reminds us that every act of humiliation carries a cost, and that kindness withheld can be a life lost. Let us not forget her. Let us not allow silence and shame to claim another voice. The workhouse that burned down. While everyone slept. At the edge of South London, where the city's sprawl gave way to fog-laden fields, the Tooting workhouse rose like a fortress, a world unto itself. Behind its tall stone walls and iron-barred windows, thousands of the city's poor eked out their existence, each day dictated by bells, curfews, and the relentless machinery of Victorian charity. The workhouse was a place of last resort, a safety net with frayed edges and sharp barbs. But one cold night in 1865, Tooting became the scene of one of the era's most devastating tragedies, a catastrophe born not of malice, but of neglect, routine, and the slow, deadly erosion of care. It was winter, and the air outside bit through coats and shawls. Inside the Tooting workhouse, the routine was familiar and unchanging. Dinner was served just after sunset, a thin gruel eaten in silence. Afterward, the women, many old, many sick, all weary, filed up narrow wooden stairways to the female dormitories, where cots were lined in rows beneath low, beamed ceilings. At 8 o'clock, as was the custom, the heavy doors to each ward were locked from the outside. Curfew was sacred in the workhouse. Once those doors closed, no inmate could leave their bed until morning, no matter what. Beneath their feet, in the basement, a handful of servants and night watchmen stoked the kitchen stoves, keeping water and food warm for the morning. The kitchen, cluttered with pots and coal scuttles, was the heart of the building after hours. It was here, as midnight approached, that someone, tired, distracted, or perhaps simply following an old habit, left a stove burning, a door ajar, and a pile of kindling a bit too close to the glowing iron. In the small hours, as a hush settled over the sleeping workhouse, the first hint of disaster crept through the floorboards. Thin threads of smoke, barely visible, began to drift upward. Inmates accustomed to the stench of coal and human bodies hardly noticed. But the fire, hungry and swift, found its fuel in the dry wood and old linens of the kitchen stores. By the time anyone realized the danger, flames were crawling up the service stairs, curling around banisters and licking at the edges of the ancient, tar-soaked beams. Panic spread faster than the fire. Someone screamed, a thin, shrill sound that snapped the dormitory awake. Women tumbled from their cots, coughing, eyes streaming as black smoke flooded the room. Some rushed to the doors, but they held firm, bolted from the outside by the nightly curfew, iron locks sealing them in. Shouts turned to pounding, fists slamming against wood, desperate voices pleading for help. The smoke thickened, suffocating, turning the air into a wall of heat and darkness. Outside, a lone night watchman finally noticed the orange glow flickering at the windows. He raised the alarm, but the workhouse had no plan, no training, no tools beyond buckets and blind hope. They fumbled with keys, shaking hands missing the locks again and again, as women screamed and clawed at the doors from inside. The scene was chaos, a confusion of shouts, splintering wood, collapsing beams, and the relentless roar of the blaze. When at last the doors gave way, the rescuers were met by a wave of searing heat, and bodies collapsed in the aisles. Some trampled in the panic, others simply overcome where they lay. One nurse would later say the sound of those voices haunted her for the rest of her life, a mixture of terror, pleading, and the bitter shock of realizing there was no way out. When dawn finally broke and the fire was beaten back, the toll was staggering. 23 women dead, many more maimed by burns and smoke, and a building gutted from kitchen to roof. In the smoldering wreckage, searchers found the women in their nightclothes, some still clutching each other, others curled beneath their cots, in vain hope the flames would pass overhead. The official cause was recorded with bureaucratic efficiency, an unattended stove. But the true causes ran deeper: systemic neglect, institutional indifference, and the deadly certainty that rules were never to be broken, even in the face of mortal danger. The aftermath was as swift as it was hollow. Inquests were held in crowded parish halls, questions asked, blame quietly deflected. Some called for reforms, for fire drills, for night staff to remain on every floor, for the abolition of locked doors and sleeping wards. Others insisted such precautions were unnecessary. That tragedy, while regrettable, was the price of managing the poor en masse. The families of the dead were given small stipends for burial. Life at Tooting resumed, with new locks fitted to new doors, and the survivors left to remember what the world tried so hard to forget. Yet the memory of that night persisted. Rumors spread that, on certain cold nights, the smell of smoke could still be detected in the rebuilt dormitory, or that the echo of desperate fists pounding on locked doors would wake the oldest residents from their sleep. For years afterward, survivors spoke in hushed voices of the women lost, not as numbers, but as mothers, sisters, daughters who deserved better than to die trapped, alone, while the city slept around them. Today, the tragedy of the Tooting Workhouse stands as a warning from history. It is a reminder that neglect kills as surely as malice, that rules meant for order can become cages in moments of crisis, and that the most vulnerable pay the highest price when society forgets to care. The names of those 23 women may be lost to time, but their story endures, a testament to the need for vigilance, compassion, and the courage to question any system that locks people away and walks away with the key. So, when you pass an old brick building or hear the peal of a fire alarm, remember Tooting. Remember that sometimes the greatest dangers are not the ones we see, but the ones we assume could never happen. And remember, most of all, those who perished behind doors that were supposed to protect them, doors that became their final, unbreakable prison. The forgotten mass grave. In the wild, wind-scoured hills of Cornwall, where the Atlantic rain flattens the grass and the old mines gape like wounds, there once stood a building known by all but loved by none, the Bodmin Union Workhouse. For generations, its gray stone walls rose over the landscape, a silent warning and a promise. If you fell, if you failed, if fortune turned its back, here you would be sent, and here, behind its locked gates, thousands would live out their days forgotten by the world outside. Yet it was not until long after the workhouse itself had fallen to ruin, its stones picked apart by weather and time, that the final secret of its cruelty would be revealed, a secret unearthed by chance and destined to haunt Cornwall's conscience forever. It began in 2003, when developers prepared to break ground for new homes on the site where the old workhouse had once stood. Surveyors and archaeologists arrived, their equipment humming among the weeds, expecting to find little more than pottery shards or old nails. But as the diggers sank into the earth, they hit something else, a tangled layer of bone, pale and brittle, packed tight as driftwood in a storm. What started as a single discovery became a cascade. Soon the team was uncovering skull after skull, tiny rib cages, long bones not yet hardened by years. The count rose swiftly, dozens, then scores, then more than 300, all in a single mass grave. There were no coffins, no names carved into stone, no records to honor who had lived or mourn who had died. The bones lay jumbled together, most of them heartbreakingly small, children who had barely begun to grow. The archaeologists paused, the weight of their discovery settling around them like the Cornish fog. This was not a cemetery, but a pit, a secret repository for the unwanted, the invisible, the utterly forgotten. Word spread quickly. Journalists descended. Families in the area began to ask uneasy questions. Who were these children? Why had they died here, unclaimed, unmarked, their existence erased even from memory? In the weeks that followed, researchers pieced together the grim arithmetic of workhouse life: high mortality, chronic malnutrition, disease unchecked by medicine or care. Inmates, especially children, succumbed to epidemics of measles, typhus, tuberculosis, sometimes sweeping through the wards like wildfire. In winter, the cold itself could be a killer, gnawing at bones already thinned by hunger. Official records, where they existed, told only half the story. The Bodmin Union Workhouse admitted thousands between its opening in the mid-1800s and its closure in the 20th century. Most entered alone, their families scattered by poverty, famine, or scandal. Babies were born here, sometimes never seeing a day outside its walls. Others arrived sick and left only as corpses, wrapped in coarse linen, carried quietly through a side door at night. What happened next was dictated not by compassion, but by economy. Coffins were expensive, space was precious. The dead were carried to the far corner of the grounds, lowered into trenches without ceremony. On stormy nights, workhouse boys would be forced to dig the graves, barely deep enough to cover the remains, no crosses, no prayers. Death, like life, was a matter of numbers and necessity. Yet, despite the harshness, there were moments of humanity. Some staff members kept secret lists of the lost children, scrawling their names in the margins of account books. Others smuggled flowers or toys into the graveyard, leaving small offerings above the unmarked pits. But these gestures could not undo the reality of a system built to hide its shame. Over decades, the mass graves multiplied. Grass grew over the burial ground, the town's memory faded. By the time the workhouse itself was demolished, almost no one alive could recall who had rested in the earth below. For Cornwall, the 2003 excavation was more than a shock. It was an indictment. The bones of the forgotten children forced the region to confront its own past. Newspapers published lists of names recovered from fragmentary workhouse registers. Memorial services were held, long after the fact, for lives that had gone unmourned. In Bodmin, residents gathered to lay flowers at the site, some weeping for ancestors they never knew, others simply grieving for the enormity of what had been lost. Yet, for every story that surfaced, a dozen more remained hidden. The mass grave was not just a relic of one building or one county, but of an entire era that placed order and thrift above mercy. The workhouse system, designed to save the poor, too often became a factory of sorrow, a place where children perished for want of bread, care, or simply a name. Their voices had been silenced in life and buried in anonymity, their stories swallowed by earth and time. But in the silence of the dig, in the careful hands of the archaeologists, something of their dignity was restored. Each bone was catalogued, each fragment of clothing preserved, each lost child acknowledged at last. Memorials were built. The story was told. And in the telling, the children of the workhouse were given back a measure of the humanity that had been denied them in life and in death. Today, the green grass of Cornwall covers the site where the Bodmin Union Workhouse once stood. There are new houses, new families, and the everyday bustle of modern life. But beneath it all, a generation of the forgotten waits, no longer invisible, no longer nameless, their memory held in the minds of those who walk above. The mass grave is a scar, but also a reminder. History remembers not just the mighty, but the smallest and the weakest. Those who lived and died without witness, until at last the earth itself could keep their secret no longer.